that case, I sentence you to a lifetime of horror on Monster Island. Don't worry, it's just a name.
He said it was just a name.
What he meant is that Monster Island is actually a peninsula.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, hey, that's where that Simpson joke came from. Regardless, each week, we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I am your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me, as always, is the Dr. Serizawa to my Okata, my co-host, Nate Story. How you doing today?
I feel like your hi everybody was extra Dr. Nick today.
I kind of leaned into it. Leaned into it.
Yeah, I liked it. It was good.
Thank you. How is my Japanese? Because I have to say, as they say in Godzilla, King of the Monsters, I'm afraid my Japanese is a bit rusty.
Yeah, you're asking the wrong person, to be fair. But, I mean, fine to my ear, whatever that means.
Great.
Great.
This week we watched Godzilla from 1954, which is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. And actually, it turns out we both also watched the American not really a remake, re-edit, redubbing, localization called Godzilla, King of the Monsters. So we'll be chatting about both of those today. You might remember it from such Simpsons episodes as Season 2's Bart Gets an F, Season 4's Marge Gets a Job, Brother from the Same Planet, and Marge in Chains, Season 6's Bart's Comet, Season 7's Treehouse of Horror 6, Season 8's Homer's Phobia and the Canine Mutiny, Season 10's Mayored to the Mob and 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, Season 11's Faith Off G's, and Season 12's Worst Episode Ever, New Kids on the Block, Hungry Hungry Homer, and Simpson Tall Tales. Wow, there are a lot of Godzilla references.
Yeah, there sure are. And most of them, to be fair, are the, famous Godzilla sound. But still, there's a lot of Godzilla references. Right now, we're in our database with the numbers crunched the way they are. Godzilla is the number 7th most referenced movie on The Simpsons in the first 13 seasons. So
based on how many things I just rambled off, I would have thought it was a bit higher than that. But still, number 7 is nothing to slouch at, especially when you consider what this movie is.
Oh,
because, we're going to get into it, but based on our research, it's not necessarily the classic that I thought it was.
Oh.
I mean, I guess like the series as a whole maybe is. Like Godzilla, the character, is a very well recognized character, recognized franchise. But Godzilla 1954 is perhaps not a particularly as well-known film as maybe I assumed it was. So This was sort of the interesting thing we discovered in our research. But before we get into the film proper, though, let's talk about The Simpsons. And we decided that, considering the subject and considering the location, we wanted to talk about Season 10, Episode 23, 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, directed by Jim Reardon, written by Donna Carey and Dan Graney. Original air date May 16th, 1999. And it guest stars George Takei, Denise Kumagai, Karen Murayama, Getty Watanabe, and Keon Young.
Keone, probably?
Keone Young? I mean, again, my Japanese is a little rusty. But more importantly, Nate, why did you pick this one of all of the... Because, I mean, obviously, this is the one where the Simpsons go to Japan. But considering we had so many to choose from, what was it about this one specifically that made you decide this is the one you wanted to cover?
Yeah, so, I mean, like I was saying before, I mean, most of the references are just the Godzilla sound, right? So there aren't actually that many times that Godzilla appears on screen. And this is one of those few times because, if you'll remember at the very end of this episode, right, they've gone to Japan. They end up on a Japanese game show. They finally, win their tickets home. And then on the way home, they get interrupted by some Godzilla-related turbulence, right?
Folks, we're experiencing some moderate Godzilla-related turbulence at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you to put your seatbelts back on. When we get to 35,000 feet, he usually does let go. So from there on out, all we have to do is worry about Mothra. And we do have reports he's tied up with Gamera and Rodan at the present time. Thank you very much.
And so you actually see Godzilla, and then he's also there with his other buddies from other Toho-produced kaiju movies like Rodan and Mothra. And then the other sort of funny, I didn't even get this joke. Probably most people don't get this joke. But there's another monster hanging out with Godzilla in this scene called Gamera. But the interesting thing about Gamera is that it is not a Toho kaiju movie.
Oh.
Gamera is a ripoff of Godzilla. It's like an off-brand thing. So it's like 3 Toho characters and then a ripoff of Godzilla hanging out with them. So it's kind of like I feel like it's kind of an inside joke, like if you know monster movies, maybe I'm reading too much into it. But, you know, the Simpsons writers are pretty geeky, so I feel like that might be a very intentional thing to throw in the off-brand Godzilla.
Right. That does feel like something that the writers or animators maybe would pull on our audience.
Yeah. And then the other interesting thing, of course, is that this episode comes out in 1999, May 16th, 1999. Godzilla, the American remake, came out almost exactly a year before this, which means that it would have come out like when this episode was being
in
produced.
Production. Right. Yeah.
And of course, you know, one of the weird claims to fame that Godzilla 98 has is that it is the single movie with the most Simpsons actors in it other than the Simpsons movie.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes. So Hank Azaria has a fairly big role in that movie as like a cameraman.
Yep.
Harry Shearer plays the head of the news station.
Okay.
And then there's also a cameo by Nancy Cartwright very briefly as like, I think, a secretary at the news station.
Right.
So all 3 of them appear. And I don't think there's any other movie that has that many Simpsons actors in it other than the Simpsons movie. So there you go. On the commentary, they sort of briefly mentioned this Godzilla remake. And they mentioned that, of course, like Hank has a fairly big role in it. So I wonder if that was sort of a nod to the fact that, you know, one of their voice actors was so prominently featured in that movie at the time.
Right. Interesting.
Do you remember this episode when it came out?
Well, this is why I really wanted to talk about it, because when I had asked you, well, why this one, in your text, you're like, well, there's another reason why I want to talk about this. But yes, this is peak, like, vividly remembering watching the show as it aired on Sunday nights, brand new episodes. Like, well, I would have been 11 years old. So yeah, this was probably like grade 6-ish or grade 5 maybe. Me and my buddy Tom Cameron probably discussed it the next morning, as we often did. So I do remember it airing, although I don't necessarily remember like having any real thoughts, feelings, or emotions attached to it. But tell me, Nate, what do you remember from when this first aired?
So I also very distinctly remember watching this episode live on Sunday night. Right. And I think this was the first Simpsons episode I watched where I was like, oh, that was only okay. Right. You know, I watched the show religiously and like watched the reruns all the time and like loved the show. And this was like the very first one where I was like, that didn't seem quite as good. It's like, you know, that episode where Bart sells his soul and then he's watching Itchy and Scratchy and he's like, he can't laugh and he doesn't find it funny. It was like that moment where I was like, I didn't know that The Simpsons could not be funny. Right. And so I feel like after this episode is sort of when I start getting a little bit more critical of the show and start distinguishing between good episodes and bad episodes a little bit more. And being like, that one was only okay, but that one was really good, right? And obviously we continue all the way to season 13 and think that there are great episodes in those later seasons of our timeline. But there are also episodes where I kind of like, I'm like, I don't really remember that one very well. Like I'm not as hot on that. So that's my memory of this episode, is kind of being lukewarm on it and being surprised by being lukewarm on it.
I mean, I think the one thing I do vividly remember was that I thought it was weird that it was an episode about them going to another country. Like it felt like a bad sitcom premise. Like, we've kind of run out of ideas, so let's send them to a wacky new country and we can do some comedy about the wacky new country they're in. Like,
right.
And they ended up doing this again a couple more times. I mean, famously, I remember the episode where they came to Canada and how excited I was that the Simpsons were going to Canada. And there were a number of decent Canadian jokes and then a couple, you know, like cheesy pot shots that of course all Americans make. But the whole thing was that they had a couple Canadian writers on the staff at the time, so at least it felt a little more appropriate. I mean, I guess they did go to Australia one, which is a great episode.
Yeah, I think it's partly though how they get there too. It's like one of those classic episodes where they're just like, I think they're like watching TV, or, you know, there's sort of like a really basic way that they end up getting to Japan. Whereas like the lead up to going to Australia is hilarious, right? Like it's really clever and weird and funny. And so I think that's part of it. Is it just kind of feels like, yeah, we've already done this, and it doesn't feel particularly creative in its premise or in its jokes too, because you know, this episode, of all the ones where they go to other places, it does feel like there are moments where I'm like, this is maybe a little racist. You know? Yeah,
that's definitely part of the awkwardness of it, is that it feels a little less loving and a little more I mean, I guess the part of the thing with the, like, there is a lot of stereotypes in that Australian episode, but like, again, it's making fun of white people, so it doesn't count, I guess. Whereas this,
well,
like,
part of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, exactly. So
I think it's telling that on the commentary they have Getty Watanabe as a guest star, and they're yeah, you know, we got like Long Duck Dong on the show, and it's like, yeah, see, that's
not.
Yeah, I think you're,
That's something to be proud about.
I mean,
guys.
nothing against Getty Watanabe, but it's more that's the way they thought about bringing him on, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, it's not my favorite episode, but it does have like some moments too that I think are pretty funny. There's an early part where they're in an internet cafe where Willie is looking at the up kilt cam.
Yes, which I thought was very funny.
Let's see what's been captured on the up kilt camera. Yeah, this lass needs a bit of groundskeeping. That's Willie!
And then, of course, there's also, like, I the other thing that I kind of do vividly remember, because it was sort of like a cultural reference, was the fact that there was the infamous seizure-inducing episode of Pokemon.
Oh, yeah,
parodied in this through the battle seizure robots or whatever they're called. But I do remember, like, hearing about this episode of Pokemon that caused a bunch of seizures and therefore was not going to air in the States, and then this like making reference to it. And again, it's one of those rare cases of the Simpsons satirizing something like really contemporary. Like, you know, that must have been a very like late addition to the episode, because as you say, like, they normally work so far back. So yeah, I you know, it's not going in my top 10 or maybe even my top 20, but it has its moments. It's got some fun little memorable moments throughout.
It's got a solid Rashomon joke.
Come on, Homer. Japan will be fun. You like Rashomon?
That's not how I remember it.
Which is more than can be said for most animated series.
That's true. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, why don't we start talking about the movie then? And we're going to talk about this movie, the sort of the Americanized localization, and a couple other things are going to come up along the way, like the aforementioned Godzilla in 1998. But Nate, how would you sum up Godzilla 1954 in a sentence?
Okay. A nuclear monster attacks Tokyo, and the people of Japan fight back.
Okay. The thing that's nice about that synopsis is it synopsizes both the Japanese version and the American version, because there is one critical element lacking in the American version that is in the Japanese version that your synopsis maybe doesn't address. So, no, that's great. And what is your background with this? Had you seen this prior to us deciding to watch it?
Yeah, no, not at all. And in fact, like, my memory of Godzilla 1998 was it was a movie I wasn't allowed to watch.
Oh, so had you not seen that even?
I don't think so.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I had seen that. Honestly, I don't think I'd ever seen a Godzilla movie before we decided to like add this to our list.
Really? Okay.
And so, you know, but at the same time, the Godzilla 98 was like so part of the culture at the time for like, you know, young boys that like, I remember the Godzilla animated series. Do you remember that? Right after the 98 movie with the cool Godzilla design from the movie.
Yeah.
And I feel like the other random touch points for me were also from TV. So like, I remember Rugrats, the main character, Tommy Pickles, is obsessed with Reptar, which of course is like a Godzilla, you know, spoof.
Oh yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, I never really thought about that, but yeah, I guess that is a Godzilla spoof.
And then the other kind of weird reference point, I guess, is like Power Rangers.
Go, go, Power Rangers!
Which is only, you know, I mean, it's not directly related to Godzilla, but just this whole idea of like kaiju and suitmation, which we're going to talk a whole lot more about, but this idea of kind of like people in rubber suits playing giants, that whole sort of genre of things I was really introduced to through Power Rangers, which of course, the interesting connection point is like, much like Godzilla was not only translated from Japanese to English and like dubbed, right? But in fact, they shot all this extra footage.
Right.
And basically recontextualized the whole, all of the action footage with these like American actors in like in Los Angeles or wherever it's supposed to take place.
It was funny watching the sort of American recut localization. You're sort of like, it's insane that they did this. Like, we would never do this today. But then I was like, well, wait a minute. Like, Power Rangers existed when we were kids. And like, that's exactly what that was. Like, it's wild to think that they were like, we can't just dub this. But if we just reshoot a bunch of footage, we can probably recycle about 50% of an episode because they're just wearing masks and we'll make it work. And like, that's wild. I was not actually allowed to watch Power Rangers as a kid, so I was very much aware of the Power Rangers, but my mom would not let me watch it because it was too violent.
Yeah, my parents were very selective about what I could and could not watch in ways that, frankly, in retrospect, don't make a lot of sense. I definitely feel like I either was allowed to or just managed to watch Power Rangers, which could be just like when it was on TV. But I was like not allowed to watch Batman the Animated Series.
Well, I was going to say, I was allowed to watch Batman the Animated Series, but not Power Rangers. Right. So, you know.
I feel like a dark color palette was maybe like what the true criteria was. It was like Godzilla 98, that takes place at night. So no, that's off book. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough.
But yeah, what about you? What was your reference point for this movie?
I mean, so yeah, had not seen the original, had not seen the localization. Did see Godzilla 98 actually at a birthday party, believe it or not. My friend Tyler Van Donk.
Love that name.
For his, I guess it would have been his 9th birthday because he was a year younger than me. We went to the movie theater and saw Godzilla 98. And it's very weird because I remember basically nothing about the movie, but I do remember the fact that we went to go see it, which is just it's weird how our brains work that way.
I've had that same experience with, it's either Batman and Robin or Batman Forever. It's like one of those two movies. I remember going to the theater to see it, and I don't remember the movie from that age at all.
Yeah, exactly. So all this to say is like, I remember that I saw it, but I don't remember anything about it. I definitely don't think I knew that anyone from The Simpsons was involved. Maybe my dad would have told me like, oh, Hank is there. But we didn't go with my dad. That's the thing. We went with Tyler's dad. So, and he wouldn't have necessarily known or cared that I was Simpsons. So I wouldn't at that point have known who Hank Azaria was to be like, oh, that's the guy from The Simpsons. So
totally.
Yeah, probably didn't realize the Simpson connection. And then these kind of movies are not really my thing. But in 2014, when the sort of American reboot happened, directed by Gareth Edwards, I saw that in theaters. And then the last couple, because they made a couple more sort of like sequels that I've watched over the years of the American series. I've watched a couple of those at home, like during the pandemic or whatever, Godzilla versus Kong or whatever it was called. But that's kind of it. Like, again, it's just not really anything that was on my radar. Again, I knew, monster movie, it's a classic. It's this like iconic thing. It's an iconic franchise, but didn't ever really seek it out just because it wasn't anything that was of interest to me. And I didn't even know that there was this American localization. Of course, not realizing that for the better part of like 50 years, the American localization was the only version that was readily available in the US, which is wild. But we're going to get into all that. So,
yeah. What I will say is, in preparation for this, I watched a bunch of Godzilla movies. So we'll talk about them more, but I ended up watching the 1998 Godzilla -1 while it was in theaters, which was, spoilers, but it was fantastic. Love that.
Very jealous that you got to do that.
And I ended up seeing the black and white version because I missed the original release, but they put it back in with the black and white version, and still, fantastic in black and white. So really liked that. And then I also watched Ghidorah, the three-headed monster from 1964, partly because I heard that this one was particularly silly and outlandish. And I wanted to get kind of the vibe of what was this series like in the middle of its long run,
Right.
like after the original but before the American reboots, because I do think that, like, from the Simpsons perspective, that's probably how they're thinking about Godzilla.
That makes sense. Well, we like to pull our plot synopses from the most interesting of locations, and usually it ends up being the back of the VHS from when we were kids. But Nate managed to track down the original press book for Godzilla, King of the Monsters! The 1956 American localization of the Japanese film. And here's how it describes Godzilla. The Japanese contribution to the current movie monster marathon is a
This is in
veritable...
the 30s?
Okay, fair enough. Well, I don't know how people in the 50s talked.
You need to sound like a gangster.
You say? 40-story high, armored-backed, spiked-head, sub-oceanic megalosaurus. Ooh, megalosaurus. That comes out of Tokyo Bay, breathing fire and destruction. It's impervious to high-voltage shock, artillery, rocket fire, and depth bombs. It explodes ships by exhaling a fiery breath upon them, turns the ocean into steam, crushes skyscrapers, stamps out whole blocks at a time, tosses railroad trains like matchsticks, sets Tokyo on fire, and terrifies the world. Wow, that sounds very exciting. Then 2 Japanese gentlemen scientists, not just scientists, but gentlemen scientists, and 1 pretty Japanese lady scientist figure out a scheme to get rid of their unwelcome guest. The film has been elaborately produced, and for all that it's an imitation of Hollywood's own juvenile thrillers of this type. Wow, okay, really editorializing. It should scare enough moviegoers to make a barrel of money for its producers. Raymond Burr is the U.S. newspaperman who happens to see it all and reports to a horrified world when he can hardly believe himself. Ain't we got fun? Jesse Zuzner, Q Magazine. Wow. Okay. That was something.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that one was fun because this is written for, what's the technical term? People who run movie theaters?
Yeah, I guess like industry and buyers, maybe?
Yeah, but yeah, so this isn't for consumers. It's to convince the people running the movie theaters that, like, they're going to make a bunch of money.
Back when you had to actively choose what are we going to screen in our theater, because we're not a multiplex where we can show, 24 Marvel movies at the same time.
Right.
And again, what's interesting, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I think we probably should get this out of the way, is that the Americanized remake, unsurprisingly, removes all of the World War II nuclear Holocaust allegory that the Japanese version very, very, very clearly has. And I would argue is what really elevates the film beyond being essentially like a B-level monster movie. But as you heard in that description, they don't really touch on any of that stuff. Where it is like a very, very clear, not only like plot point, but like thematic point of the Japanese original.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's kind of a point of contention among critics. Like, it's definitely less explicit in the American version, but like it's still kind of there. Like, the nuclear testing is still like the reason why Godzilla exists and stuff. So it's like, I guess the question is, like, how much could or would American audiences read between the lines? Right. And how much would they just be like, yeah, whatever, it's a monster movie. But yeah, I agree. It definitely makes it way less explicit in the American version. And introduces Raymond Burr.
Yes, exactly. Canada's own Raymond Burr.
Indeed.
I don't know so there you go. Well, okay, so speaking of all of this, how did this come to be, Nate?
Yeah, it's one of those weird things. It's a movie that obviously has been talked about to death, but at the same time, the sort of story of how it gets made, I had to look at a lot of different sources and kind of piece it together a little bit.
Okay.
But here's what I found. So in the early 1950s, Toho Studios, which produces this movie, they wanted to create a movie that spoke to current affairs in the world. So this is post-World War II. Japan, from the American perspective, Japan was the bad guys, right?
Right.
And so they're trying to kind of speak to everything that's going on right now. They're also looking internationally and trying to think about Japan's standing in the world, I guess.
Right.
So Toho producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was trying to make a movie called In the Shadow of Honor, which was about Japan's occupation of Indonesia during World War II. So this was like a true story sort of movie And he was in Indonesia trying to convince the Indonesian government to partner with Toho to make this movie. And then he just failed. He wasn't able to get them to do it. So on his flight back to Japan, Tanaka had this idea. He had heard about, in America, the re-release of King Kong, 1933's King Kong, which we covered on the show. It was re-released in 1952 and was like a huge hit at the time.
Okay.
The re-release was one of those things that like pioneered TV advertising and stuff like that and just did gangbusters. And then in 1953, there was also this movie called The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Have you heard of this movie?
Not at all, no.
So it's interesting because Godzilla borrows a lot from this movie, 20,000 Fathoms.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So it's about, tell me if this sounds familiar, a giant dinosaur that is awakened by nuclear testing.
Okay.
In the Arctic, though. And this one actually is animated by Ray Harryhausen. So, it's a stop motion movie, but it's basically a dinosaur comes and attacks New York City because it's awakened by nuclear testing in the Arctic, and then the military has to fight it off. So it all sounds very, very familiar, of course, to Godzilla. But the interesting thing is, up until like 1952, while America was still occupying Japan after World War II, there was all this sort of, anxiety around nuclear weapons, but you weren't allowed to talk about it in Japan.
Oh.
And so after 1952, so 2 years before this movie comes out, suddenly you're allowed to actually talk about nuclear weapons, and their sort of role in the world, and America having the bomb and Russia now like competing, like all of that sort of stuff. So that's really in the zeitgeist right now. And so basically, in a lot of ways, Godzilla sort of takes this premise of the beast from 20,000 fathoms and does what Toho wanted to do, which is talk about contemporary issues in Japan. Right. So instead of the Arctic, it's actually atomic testing in the Pacific Ocean, which was happening, right? The H-bomb at Bikini Atoll and all of that. Even more so, one thing that was like ripped from the headlines at this point was this Japanese fishing vessel, which was actually contaminated by fallout from nuclear testing in the Pacific.
Oh, wow.
So that opening scene in Godzilla where, the fishing boat gets attacked by Godzilla and they just see a flash, all of that's actually taken basically from the headlines.
Wow.
So they're really just like taking this initial idea that, again, this is something that I couldn't tell. Had they seen The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, or had they just heard about its success in America?
Right.
I couldn't find an answer to that question. So it could be that they're actually like, taking some visual cues, or it could just be like a game of telephone where they're like, okay, there's this movie, it's doing really well, here's what it's about, and we could do our own version.
It is interesting, too, that they say that they were inspired by King Kong, because as I was watching it, I kept thinking about King Kong, and I was like, obviously this has this whole like nuclear underlying, thematic element, but otherwise there are a lot of similarities. So this is the other thing we should probably mention is that Nate watched Godzilla 1954 first and then watched the American localization, and I thought it would be fun to do it the other way around. So I watched the American localization first and then watched the original afterwards, just to sort of like compare and contrast. But anyway, they even have like the scene where they go to the island and there's this like native ceremony on the island, which is obviously like, it's just, there's all these little
and the
pieces.
native people are the ones with the word for the monster.
Yes, exactly. So there were all of these elements where I was like, oh, like this feels like they're borrowing a lot from King Kong.
Totally.
So it's interesting that they came right out and sort of admitted this as much, but did not realize that this other film, the 20,000 Fathoms film, also was such a huge influence. But looking it up on Wikipedia right now, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm definitely seeing where they got some of these ideas from.
Yeah, totally. I think the biggest thing that is funny, and it's funny because, like King Kong, as we talked about in that episode, like changes size just based on kind of like whatever's convenient, basically.
Right, yeah.
But like in this movie, Godzilla is enormous.
Right.
Like so huge, like bigger than buildings. Whereas in, King Kong 1933, it's like, he climbs the Empire State Building.
Yeah,
the Empire State
yeah.
Building's much larger than he is. Whereas in this movie, it looks like Godzilla could like tip over the Empire State Building,
Right.
Now you have these like Godzilla versus Kong movies, and there were Godzilla versus Kong movies in like, I think the 70s and the 80s and whatever as well. But it's like, they're completely different sizes in the original versions of this. So anyway.
Totally.
So once they had this sort of seed of this idea, it really took, there were a lot of people involved in the success of this movie, obviously. But like in my mind, there were kind of two people that were really key to the vision of the movie. And that's the director, Ishiro Honda, and the special effects guy behind it named Eiji Tsuburaya, I think. So Honda, he began working at Toho in 1933, same year that King Kong came out. And he basically like worked his way up. They had a very sort of strict system of how you learned to become a director. So he was an assistant director on a lot of movies between stints serving in World War II for Japan. And his first feature film was only a couple years before this. It was called Blue Pearl and was released in 1951. So he's very early in his directorial career and like did actually a wide variety of different movies, but is best remembered for his kaiju movies.
Right.
Tsuburaya is 10 years older than him and was like always a brilliant tinkerer. He was like an inventor before he was involved in the movies and actually got into special effects after seeing King Kong in 1933.
Again, interesting.
Yeah. But by that point, he'd actually already been working in film for a decade. And the year after that, when he was like, oh yeah, maybe I do want to do special effects, he actually built the first iron crane for like camera work. So like cranes had already existed for a long time. Like you had D.W. Griffith uses one in Intolerance back in 1916. But this design is basically the same design that's used today in crane shots.
Oh, there you go. That's really fascinating.
Yeah. So this is a brilliant guy, a very creative, and I think it totally comes across in this movie. And without the sort of interaction between these two people, I just don't think that this movie would have really worked and become as iconic and influential, I guess, more than anything, as it was. So they both worked together on a movie in 1953 called Eagle of the Pacific, which was, again, like a contemporary war film. And then after this, they just continued to collaborate on many, many more kaiju movies, many of them featuring Godzilla. But the interesting thing is, so Honda was also actually a frequent collaborator of Akira Kurosawa, which you wouldn't necessarily know based on the sort of reputation of Godzilla. But he was an AD on Stray Dog, Kagemusha, and Dreams, and many others as well. But those are the ones that kind of jumped out at me. Meanwhile, Tsuburaya also originated the multi-billion-dollar Ultraman franchise. Speaking of sort of Power Rangers and that kind of thing.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, he sort of spawned what's known as the Kyodai hero genre, which starts with Ultraman.
Okay, interesting.
So he's kind of like one of those really, really important figures in special effects driven movies in Japan in general. And those two sort of like threads of like kaiju movies and Kyodai hero movies and TV are like two of the most popular special effects genres in Japan. So pretty amazing.
And arguably like two of the biggest sort of Japanese export, like beyond like anime.
Totally.
Like those are the things that everybody kind of has a familiarity with, even if they're not like big into Japanese cinema or whatever.
Yeah, 100%. So in terms of the production, this movie was the highest budgeted Japanese film to date at the time.
Wow.
But this is the crazy thing is principal photography only took 51 days.
Holy crap.
So they started in August of 1954, the year this movie comes out, and ended in September of 1954.
Wow.
The movie comes out in October of 1954.
Oh okay.
So like, and this was sort of a message that I kept hearing sort of like as I read through all of the details, is just like the production cycles in Japanese film in the industry of the time were just so much faster than Hollywood. To the point where I was reading that the composer was like, oh yeah, like back then you typically had a few days to compose a score for a movie.
I read a fascinating bit of trivia that the score and the sound effects were recorded simultaneously.
Wow.
So as they're recording all the music, the Foley artists are recording the Foley, and they said if any of the Foley artists miss a cue, then they would have to start the take over again,
Crazy.
Including with the, which to me seems like that would take more effort and time than just like do the scoring session and do the, but well, but that's how they did it. So,
but I think the result of that in this movie is that a lot of the Foley and the music are sort of orchestrated together.
Yes.
And also the composer's the one who came up with the sound effects for Godzilla.
Right.
And they're all musical instruments and implements.
Yeah.
So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But in the meantime, I did want to talk a little bit about this Americanization because to your point earlier, it's just super weird.
It's fascinating.
And really fascinating and sort of speaks to the changing ways that we've thought about foreign film and how people accept it. So as I was saying, after World War II, you had cultural critics in Japan seeing the need to improve the country's sort of global reputation and like cultural exports as an important way to do that.
Right.
However, both they and American critics actually agreed that subtitles were a barrier to doing this.
I mean, look, like that's still a conversation we're having today. And when you think about it, the culture around cinema is very different in 2024 than it would have been in 1954. Because 1954, cinema is it's not even 50 years old yet. Like it literally hasn't existed long enough for there to have that sort of established set of ideals and everything. So you think about the fact that people today are still there are people who are resistant to subtitles. You can only imagine what a 1954 audience would be like. So I totally understand that point of view.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and like when we were kids, I think especially there was still very much that perception. And I think it's only been probably in the last decade or so that I think there's been a real shift in that. Like I'm thinking about Godzilla -1, right?
Yeah.
Did very well. And it's got subtitles, sort of unapologetic.
It's true. I think, as you say, the last decade or so, even when we were in high school, it's like, yes, you could find international film, but you would go to the art house cinemas.
Yeah.
Or you'd go to the independent cinemas or the rep cinemas. But Cineplex was not running foreign movies. Like, unless you were, like I live in Markham, which has a very high Asian population. So we screen a lot of Asian films in our Cineplexes. But outside of that, you just would not see that stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas today, like, you do, because these movies break through, so you can go and see The Zone of Interest at your local Cineplex, or you can see Parasite, because not just because it won the Oscar, but even prior to that. I feel like the movie that I vividly remember being the one that kind of started to break through things, and I remember regular people talking about, was Pan's Labyrinth. I remember when that came out, it was a movie in Spanish and it was subtitled, but regular theaters were starting to have it because it was building this incredible reputation of like, you have to see this movie. It's incredible. So yeah, but it is interesting how much things have shifted really in the last 15, 20 years.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, just case in point. So the number one Japanese feature in America prior to Godzilla was Rashomon. And it actually only made $200,000 in the US, which even at the time, that was not very much for a movie. So Japanese studios actually started demanding that international distributors create dubs.
Right.
For movies.
Okay, interesting.
They were part of like what was driving the sort of culture around dubs. But very few distributors would ever accept those terms because it's an additional cost.
A large additional cost, because you have to not only translate it, you then have to record the dub.
Right. And so this is the interesting thing, is that it's like a total flip of how we think about it now, where dubs are kind of seen as like, oh, well, that's not authentic and blah, blah, blah. If you're really serious, you watch the movie with subs, et cetera, et cetera. Back then, it was a mark of prestige to get a dub.
Interesting.
Because it's an additional cost. Putting in the work.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So one producer that kind of got the marketability of international films was this guy named Joseph E. Levine. And he was working for Burstyn Mayer, and probably like some of the best known movies that he helped import were Rome Open City in 1945 and Bicycle Thieves in 1948, which of course is like a, very well known sort of
classic
touchstone.
art house.
And so he helped get dubs made of those. So he was the one who saw Godzilla as this big opportunity and decided to take it one step further beyond dubs. And again, this is like a prestige move to actually invest in not only dubbing the movie, but in reshooting parts of it to localize it for American audiences. Right. That's seen as a sign of respect to Godzilla in many ways. So Levine hires this director, Terrell A. Morse, who's actually a well-known film doctor. He's the guy that you like, you show your movie to a test audience and it just absolutely bombs. And you call up Morse and you're like, please come and help us fix this movie. And he would come and do reshoots. And so he's an expert at kind of inserting footage that's shot later into an existing movie. And that's like exactly what they do with Godzilla, basically.
Well, and it's interesting because I read he was also like, originally he worked for many years as an editor. They really, they wanted someone who had like a keen editorial eye who would be able to like look at it and be like, okay, we need to change this, and this, and here we'll go back and shoot it and we can do so. So, just as a fellow editor, you got to shout out the editorial greats that are out there.
Totally.
Even if they are creating American localizations of Japanese kaiju films. So.
I mean, it's an interesting magic trick he pulls, I will say.
It is. I
mean, it's a worse movie, but the
well,
way...
without question, it's a worse movie.
But the way that he's able to integrate the footage is pretty impressive for the most part. As long as you don't know Japanese and recognize that he's turned the script into gobbledygook.
It is weird. It works. And I have to say, I'm surprised at how much Japanese dialogue was left in it, because there are large swaths where they just have Japanese dialogue unsubtitled. Now, how do they get around this? Well, they have our hero, Steve Martin, say, my Japanese is a little... Not that Steve Martin. Raymond Burr as Steve Martin. Nudge a Japanese guy and say...
Afraid my Japanese is a little rusty.
And then they just like tell him... Everything feels very expository because they have to find some way to like tell the American audience what these Japanese people are saying. And it's like a clever enough idea of like, okay, well, let's have an American protagonist who doesn't speak the language, so he would have to ask what they were saying. And we can do it in this sort of like quasi-naturalistic way, which, again, we're watching this 70 years later. Like, we're coming at it with a very different perspective. So, like, who knows? Maybe it plays really well in 1956. But today it just comes across as, like, super cornball and super cheesy. But there is some artistry going on. And I think one of the things that I thought was super interesting is that the American localization makes heavy use of voiceover from the Steve Martin character, sort of explaining the sort of getting from point A to point B and so on and so forth.
And it starts at a different place in the time.
Yeah, which is super interesting. But the Japanese version, it also sort of struggles with like, how do we get this expository stuff out there? And it does it predominantly with newspaper headlines.
Right.
Like there are so many cutaways to newspaper headlines in the movie where it's like, okay, this is going to explain what we've just seen, or like the fallout of what we've just seen, or like what is the government now doing? Like it's always done in this like newspaper headline. So it's interesting that they're both having to do the same dance of like, we kind of have to explain how we're getting from point A to point B. It's the show don't tell, quite literally show don't tell, and then the tell don't show approach of each film. So the localization is obviously, I think it's about 10 to 20 minutes shorter than the Japanese version, despite, you know, a considerable chunk of new material that's being shot. And so like when I watched the two sort of like back to back, essentially, seeing what they used and what they didn't use was interesting. But I can't remember what episode we were talking about this, but I had said like, having watched the Simpson episode, like the Treehouse of Horror that condensed the story into like a 12-minute segment. And I'm like, I kind of feel like I didn't need to see the movie because it really just distilled it really well. While the American version obviously doesn't distill any of the sort of thematic nuclear element, I do think it does a pretty good job of just taking that story and like tightening it and making the pace like really snappy and kind of getting rid of some of the fat that kind of didn't work for me, to be perfectly honest, in the Japanese. Like, I'm thinking specifically about like the romance subplots, and there's certain elements that just don't really do anything for me. It's a very interesting exercise watching the two of them. This is not a simple case of like, oh, the Americans came along and they butchered our masterpiece. It's because it's just
pretty thoughtful. It's clumsy in some ways, but then the original is also clumsy in some ways.
Well, at the end of the day, I think they both feel like B movies. Maybe it's unfair to judge it that way, but I don't think that even the like Japanese original has this sort of prestige of being, this feels like a huge budget movie.
Totally. As you were saying, like Godzilla King of the Monsters, that's the version that not only Americans saw, but most people outside of Japan saw until 2004, the 50th anniversary of the movie when they actually released it broadly.
Which is insane to me. Like, it's insane to me that this thing that has spawned, I think I read something like 36 sequels.
38?
Like, it is, something like that. Like, it is considered the longest running franchise in cinema history. It's wild to think that the original film was not, I mean, obviously it was available in Japan because that's where it's made, but like we sort of think of like America and Hollywood as like, this is sort of the home where everything comes together. To think that you could not readily see the original version of this iconic film that started it all until 2004 is just, it's crazy. That's genuinely crazy.
And again, when this was shown in France, they didn't take Godzilla 1954
No.
and translate it into French. They took Godzilla King of the Monsters 1956 and translated that into French.
Yeah, which
so
is
it's
wild.
just like it's this game of broken telephone, right? And in the process, I feel like parts of the original movie have just been lost to pop culture a little bit. Like you mentioned the love story, right?
Yep.
Like how many people knew that there was a love story in Godzilla?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Or like any of the human characters in the original, I didn't grow up knowing anything about them because those are not parodied, right? They're not part of the way that any of this pop culture has been transmitted, probably because, again, for the first 50 years of the movie's existence, that version was not really that available. And Raymond Burr is the main character of the version that most people saw, weirdly.
Yeah. Realistically, this is the version that the Simpsons writers would have seen unless they happened to have lived in the few pockets of America that had the original Japanese version in their sort of like art house cinema on the rare occasions when it was released. Like, so in many respects, like that's the one that we should be covering because when the show that we're talking about was being written and created, they literally could not see the Japanese original unless they happened to be in Japan or whatever.
One interesting thing that came up on the Criterion commentary for the movie by film historian David Kalett was that it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, though, too, because if you pour more money into a movie, you're also going to spend more on marketing it.
Right.
And so it's like they chose these movies that they thought would do well, and then they poured money into dubbing them, and then they're like, well, now it has to do well.
Right.
And so they're actually promoting it. Whereas the other ones that are just subs, maybe they're saying like, "Wow, this isn't going to do well anyway, so we best not promote it." Right. So it's sort of like, is it a self-fulfilling prophecy, or were they right? It's kind of hard to know historically, of course, because there's no counterexample really.
It is this kind of fascinating artifact in that regard, and I can't think of any other. Like nothing comes to mind that's like that because again, this idea of localizing a film is so rare. I mean, I know Dracula did that. There's famously like the Spanish version of Dracula, which is allegedly better than the Hollywood version.
I'm sure you saw that meme that was going around recently of the what is it? The Brazilian version of Star Wars?
Yes. Oh my God, it's so good.
Something like that with the beer
the
commercials
cerveza?
cut
Yeah.
into it. I mean,
Brilliant.
amazing.
Brilliant. So good.
Cerveza Cristal.
So there's your other localization.
Yeah. No, that's 100%. Okay, Nate. Well, let's talk about some of the highlights and the lowlights. And again, spoiler alert. I have to be perfectly honest. Admittedly, this is not really my cup of tea, but I kind of am lukewarm on both of these films. But for the sake of argument, Godzilla 1954, I really wanted to like it more than I feel like I ended up enjoying it. Mm-hmm. There are elements of it that I like and respect, and again, I sort of we talked about the special effects and the sort of the groundbreaking nature of those. But I don't know. By the end, it definitely won me over because I think they really get into the themes of nuclear experimentation and the parallels to Oppenheimer and this idea of like, once we do it, we can't undo it and all of this stuff. Like, and I found that really compelling. As I said, that kind of doesn't happen until like the last 20 minutes of the movie or so. But it didn't really do a lot for me. So I'll be interested to hear your take on the highlights and the lowlights because
and maybe I'll keep my cards close to my chest.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's start with one thing that I think I'm hoping you'll agree is a highlight, which is the music and the score and the sound in this movie, because
absolutely,
like from the very beginning of this movie, the first thing you get, you remember in film class, back in high school, I feel like one of the things that we did was we looked at the opening of, I think it's Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones movie.
Yep.
Right. And before you even get to the first image, you're already hearing the sounds of the jungle and all of that. This movie is doing a similar thing from the very beginning. You're getting the score over the opening credits, but you're also hearing what you'll soon see is the sound of Godzilla's footsteps and then Godzilla's roar. And both
that
of those
iconic roar. Which,
totally. And talk about like leading with your strengths. I just think both of those sound effects are so evocative. And I think the sad part about the score is that probably because it's so rushed, it's just very limited. There's only a few sort of sequences to the score that get reused a lot. But the actual score is really great, I think, and really evocative. And I just wish there was more of it, frankly. But yeah, I mean, what did you think about the sort of score and sound in this movie?
Yeah, it's interesting because in my notes I wrote at one point, this score sounds really familiar. And I don't know that it was familiar. It was just like, it was so strong that it evoked this sort of like, oh, I must, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it's because elements of it were reused in the remakes. I'm not sure, but I was just like, oh, this feels like something I know. And that's sort of high praise that like, it evokes that sort of like John Williams-esque, like, oh, this is a great theme. I'm going to remember this. This is going to be something that sticks in my mind. And it's interesting, again, the parallels to King Kong, because if you remember, one of my biggest gripes with that movie was how like silent it was, how much it lacked in ambience, and just the soundscapes felt very dead and flat and lifeless.
Yeah.
And that is not how I would describe anything in this movie. Like this movie, yes, it has a very 50s soundscape in that it has that sort of distorted, not quite high quality monaural tone, but it does feel more modern in the sense that there is a soundscape. There is something there that is setting the mood and setting the tone, even if it's not through music.
Yeah. So I feel like we should talk about the roar because it's one of the things that's the most parodied on The Simpsons.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with good reason, because it is so iconic. Essentially, they started out doing something that I think maybe this is what they did for King Kong, if I'm remembering correctly, which was sort of recording and distorting animal sounds and combining them in interesting ways. So they like literally went to the zoo and would record all sorts of different animals and try to combine them to find the right thing, like everything from, the things you'd expect, like big predators and stuff, but also like birds. And I think they actually just got desperate eventually and were recording every little thing because they couldn't find something that hit the tone that they were looking for. And so eventually the composer, Akira Ifukube, came up with this idea for an alternative. So he apparently took the string off of his contrabass and rubbed it with leather gloves soaked in pine tar to create friction. So it would just be like really hard to move the glove across the string, and then he recorded that sound and distorted it, and that's Godzilla's roar.
Right.
And you could just speed it up or slow it down and get different tones and all of that kind of thing. But that's the sound. So, and it's just like nothing else.
Yeah.
I think the other interesting thing is, you pointed out the sort of limitations of the era, right, in terms of sound production. And I think that that's also actually part of why the roar works, is because just the ability to actually kind of process that sound was limited. And so it is distorted, right? And like the case in point, I was reading that for Gareth Edwards' 2014 reboot, the sound designers for that movie, Eric Adol and Ethan van der Rijn, they created their own version of the sound effect. And they started by trying to recreate it that way, and they couldn't get it to work right. And it's probably because, again, the recording equipment's too good at this point. And so they ended up having to get really creative and find other ways to create vibrations and friction using metal and all this other stuff. I think they even used supersonic vibrations and scientific microphones and then pitched it down to the realm of human hearing. And that's how they end up making like an equivalent sound, which I think is really cool. It's just such dedication to recreating the spirit of the original Godzilla and not just like, the sound. The other thing I guess that's interesting is Godzilla's footsteps, right? As I mentioned, almost as iconic, I'd say, as the roar. And it's because, again, it's actually musical equipment that's making the sound. So rather than sort of realistic Foley of any kind, what they actually did was the composer remembered one time when he was conducting, one of his orchestras, he accidentally stepped on this like weird makeshift amp that they had created for the recording. And it had this metal coil inside. So when you stepped on it, it was really, really resonant. And so that's what he used. He just took this amp and like would strike it and record it. And it makes this really specific, unique sound that's just like nothing else. It doesn't sound like reality. It doesn't sound like nature, but it also doesn't really sound like a musical instrument. It's its own thing. So just really creative. After the opening credits, we open with this attack, like I was saying, on this fishing vessel that was based on the Lucky Dragon incident. What did you think about this opening? Because it's kind of like, opening with some action and kind of meant to be mysterious, but did it pique your interest, or how did you feel about that opening sequence of the fishing vessel getting attacked?
Well, so it's interesting because, again, having watched the other film first,
right, the American one,
the way that it's structured, I do think that attack does happen first in both films, but there's more preamble in the Americanized version because it starts with like Raymond Burr is covered in debris and he's like waking up from the debris, and then they show him in the hospital, and then they sort of like, and here's how this all happened, and then they get into it. So
it's like a film noir almost, because
it's like a framing device almost, like to get you into this narrative. So again, the effects in this sequence are excellent. The acting is pretty good. You get that sort of tense sense of like something very, very bad is happening. And I didn't realize that this was actually based on an actual event that had happened, which sort of like knowing that would make it that much more like I was reading in the trivia that they were sort of saying like that was intentional so that a Japanese audience watching it would have that sort of top of mind, this very, very recent event that had happened, which would make this feel the equivalent of like having a plane hijacking happening in a film that came out in December of 2001. And like audiences would be deeply disturbed by it just because of how close it was to reality.
Yeah, exactly. But again, it's one of those things where, when you know the context, you're like, that's very clever. And I appreciate that. But like from a contemporary perspective, I'm kind of like, it's very abstract what happens. You kind of see like some bubbling water and then the flash and some sounds and then the boat's on fire. Like a lot of the early parts of this movie before you see Godzilla, I find kind of hard to follow in terms of like what exactly is happening, I guess.
Yeah, if I'm being perfectly honest, that is part of my complaint with the film. And again, I will say I had started consuming some Japanese whiskey before the film started. So I was, and it hit me real hard, real fast. I guess I hadn't eaten enough that day. And I wasn't too worried because I was like, well, I've seen the American version, so I kind of know what's going to happen. But I did find it a little hard to follow at times, like what exactly was going on and like keeping track of who are all of these characters, because there's a lot of characters in the Japanese version.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I did find the film a little bit hard to follow. But like, again, you don't get the first glimpse, and this is another one of those things where it's similar to King Kong, but you don't get the first glimpse of Godzilla until about the 20-minute mark.
Yeah.
And even then, it's still like I think you just see like his head. You don't really see.
over the hill.
Yeah. So again, you're sort of like, they're building it up and again, this is something modern films do as well, where you're sort of building that mystery of like something bad is happening. We don't really know what it is. Was this a military strike? Is it man-made? We don't know. So like, it's an interesting plot device, but I don't know that it's perfectly executed, or at least to an audience looking back, it kind of comes across as a little muddled.
Right. Yeah, I feel like, for me, the special effects are at their best when there is actually Godzilla on screen.
Oh, 100%.
And I think that, like, some of these other moments of, like, flashes and bubbling and, like, buildings crashing and stuff that happens in the first half hour or so are some of the weaker moments because they read as confusing to me now. But the thing that is really striking to me is actually the aftermath of that, where you get this sort of chaos of like reporting and getting the information and crowds coming into control rooms and like the town hall meeting or all of that stuff, and just the sort of panic around it feels really smart to me. It feels like real life, I guess, like how people react when horrible things happen, I guess.
Totally.
So that really resonated with me. And that's also when you start to get some of the main characters of the movie.
Let's talk about these characters, Nate, because again, there was a lot going on and a lot of it felt kind of unnecessary. I sound like one of those horrible American producers who's like, we don't need any of this bullshit.
No, you sound like an editor.
But it's just, I really had a hard time keeping track of like, who's this? What's their relation? She's the daughter of, and he's and that's the fiance, and that's the ex-lover. It's just
there's a bit of almost like a soap opera aspect to this. Not everything that's going on with all of the characters has to do with the themes. They just have these other things going on in their lives that are not really that relevant to Godzilla or the effort to stop Godzilla or the war or nuclear armament or anything like that, right?
It feels like a very sort of like, we're in the 1950s, everything needs to have like a romance, love story, like you say, a soap opera, like so that we can then sneak in these underlying themes. But like to me, the underlying theme, that's what I'm interested in. And the Godzilla, like that's what I'm interested in. You know, the rampage sequence, that's what I don't give a shit about any of this stuff. So the fact that they sort of take so much time dealing with it, and like those were the scenes that to me I was the most sort of like uninterested in. Like I never skipped through them, but I just kind of like would lose interest because it's just like, I get, at the risk of sounding like a crass American, I'm like, get to the monster stuff. Like,
so
I sound like Homer.
Yeah. What I'll say is this was actually the stuff that I was kind of most fascinated by, because it's the stuff that's the most completely erased by parodies of Godzilla. Where it's just
and
this is
arguably
totally new to me.
And I would say also like completely erased by the Americanized localization.
That too.
I've always had this philosophy of when it comes to adaptations, you're always best to watch the adaptation or the new thing first. Because then you can go back and watch the original and have an appreciation for the differences. Whereas when you watch an original and then you see the remake or the adaptation, you're always like, well, it's not as good as the thing that came before. So I always sort of like to do this of like, I like to see the thing that came afterwards and then go back, and then you can sort of appreciate them on their own terms. Whereas I feel like when you do it the other way around, you're always like, well, the book was better than the movie, or like the original is better than the remake. It's one of these interesting things of watching that King of the Monsters version before, is that it sort of streamlines the story to the elements that are the strongest. And I think it sort of rightfully recognizes, and again, it maybe erases a little too much of the relationships because you just like have no idea what the relationships of any of these characters are, but it recognizes that it doesn't need any of that stuff, and that the monster elements and the attack on the cities, there's enough there to sustain the audience and sustain the plot.
Right. It's interesting that you talk about adaptations, because I had the experience of watching Godzilla -1 before watching this as well, which you could say in some ways is maybe a reboot, maybe a remake of some kind, but it takes place in the same time period, right after World War II.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and it is about the original emergence of Godzilla. So it is kind of a reset of the series, and it's actually very focused on the people. But I think that he does a better job of tying in these people's like personal struggles with the themes of the movie, of like living in post-war Japan and all of those things. So all that said, let's dig into the actual characters and talk a little bit about them. So we got this couple, Hidetoh Ogata and Emiko Yamane. And I mean, Ogata is like, I don't know, salvage guy?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And then Amiko is the scientist and the daughter of a famous
lady
scientist. Yes, she's a lady scientist.
Yeah.
Yes, she's the daughter of a famous scientist named Dr. Kyohei Yamane.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like, there isn't a lot to these characters, you know, like, Ogata and Yamane are in love, and they're sort of called upon to figure out what's going on. Yamane is also kind of gets involved in figuring out what's going on with these attacks and Godzilla and all that sort of stuff. And like the main thing, I guess, is that Ogata and Yamane have a difference of opinion about what should happen. Right. And Yamane is a little bit more like Godzilla should be studied. And Ogata is sort of like, no, it's too dangerous. We just need to kill it.
Yeah, we have to destroy it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that's kind of like the main point of contention. And then you have one other character named Dr. Daisuke Serizawa, who is yet another scientist.
With an eye patch.
Who wears an eye patch, so that which helps with recognizability. And Emiko is actually, I believe, engaged to Dr. Serizawa.
Yeah, but then she calls the engagement off to be with
Ogata.
Ogata. Yeah.
Yeah. And
again,
so
this is all like it's very convoluted and unnecessary, but
yeah, it's
sure.
just kind of something that's happening in the background and is very soap opera-y. But Serizawa also introduces like another sort of philosophical viewpoint, because essentially he has invented this weapon that can destroy Godzilla, but doesn't want to use it because he's seen what super weapons can do, like the A-bomb and the H-bomb.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want it to be used by anyone, whether it's the Japanese government or the Americans or anyone else. And so he's sort of holding it back.
Yeah,
so
and that's the most compelling element of the entire film to me. And the thing that spoke to me the most, again, you know, we talked in the Oscar episode about Oppenheimer being my favorite film of the last year. And so like the parallels are obviously intentional, because not that the parallels to Chris Nolan's Oppenheimer, but Oppenheimer the person and his whole moral dilemma of I've created this device, and now that I made it, I can't uncreate it, and I can't tell them what to do with it. And that is basically what Serizawa is saying. He's like, once the government knows that this thing exists, even if I don't want to ever tell them, what's to stop them from compelling me to tell them?
Yeah.
And that is where the film really starts to open up for me, as this like the themes of nuclear armament, as you say, like once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it. But also it's this idea of like, there's this creature of mass destruction, and the only way to destroy it is to unleash something that could ultimately cause even more destruction. But is it worth it to stop the very localized mass destruction? That's far more interesting than this idea of like, do we destroy it or do we study it? All of that sort of stuff in the film doesn't interest me, but I understand why it's there. So
yeah. I think, again, the human drama is at its best when it's talking about what's going on philosophically in the movie. And it's definitely weakest when it's kind of just like, yeah, I want to be with you, but I can't. And I couldn't tell him because I was too shocked by his invention. And
I
just
didn't
a lot
want
of
to tell
that
my
kind
dad.
of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so the other interesting thing that I noticed was the older doctor, Dr. Yamane, gets top billing in this movie. And so I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting, because like if you're just looking at the characters, like he doesn't seem like the main character. But then I looked at their filmographies, and he's sort of like the elder statesman on screen.
Ah, okay.
And so he actually appeared in 21 of Akira Kurosawa's 30 films, this guy.
Holy crap.
Takashi Shimura, including his directorial debut film, Sanshiro Sugata, Rashomon, as we, a movie that keeps coming up on this episode. And Seven Samurai as well, which came out the same year as this movie. He's like a big deal. Whereas all of the other actors in this are like best known for this movie and basically get typecast after this movie into doing monster movies with Toho.
And should we talk about Mr. Steve Martin? Not the Steve Martin, but this Steve Martin?
Yeah.
Raymond Burr?
Why the hell not? I mean, admittedly, I watched the American version with the commentary on.
So you didn't watch the actual... Okay, fair enough,
my take on Raymond Burr is probably pretty limited, I'd say. But what did you think about Raymond Burr?
I mean, it's fine. It's hard not to watch his performance and just think of it as being very comical. And I mean, it's one of the most Simpson-esque elements. He just keeps showing up and then like finding the other Japanese guy and being like, I can't understand what they're saying. Please explain what's going on. Like, it's as a plot construction, it makes sense that, okay, so he wouldn't speak the language and we don't speak the language, but it almost should be reversed of like, there should be a Japanese hero and then an American sidekick, and the American sidekick doesn't understand what's going like, so but yeah, I mean, he's fine. I would say none of the performances in the American localization are particularly strong. You said that you felt it's kind of impressive what they've been able to do. And I believe you compared it in the text message to me to Zelig, the Woody Allen film, which I think is an incredible technical achievement. Whereas to me, this feels a little bit more like Plan 9 from Outer Space, where like you can tell that they're taking Bela Lugosi's same footage over and over again. And then, now we're using Ed Wood's dentist. Like, it's just, there's a little too much obvious like re-editing going on at times. But again, based on what I've read, that was not the feeling at the time. So
yeah, I mean, I felt like the recreations of the sets and the angles and stuff were pretty good. And, you know, like, again, I don't have as good a grasp on how the story sort of fits together, other than the structure of like where they start the story and that kind of thing. But moment to moment, I don't know how well the scenes play. But just visually, I thought it was impressive that they were able to kind of insert him in, you know, relatively seamlessly.
When you consider that they didn't have all of the technology that we have today in order to do it better, I suppose that, yes, it is pretty impressive by 1954 standards.
So I guess, you know, let's talk about the good stuff.
Yeah,
you know,
please.
Let's move on to the rampages. So we get like several different sequences of Godzilla attacking a ship and then attacking the city and then attacking the city again, and like the military fighting back. You know, at one point they put up a big electrical barrier, again taken from The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. That's directly from that movie.
Interesting. Okay.
But yeah, what did you think about these scenes? We talked about it a little bit, but did you have any sort of favorite moments or moments that like particularly didn't work for you?
I mean, my overall feeling is that the more I saw, the more the seams started to show, and then the less impact they had. Which is just, again, look, it's the editor in me. Less is more. It's the classic thing about any monster movie. The monster you create in your mind is always scarier than the monster you see on screen. And it's interesting, I said to you as well, like, again, the King Kong of it all. I said it's kind of shocking that this movie is being made 20 years after King Kong, because it doesn't feel like it's pushing the boundaries to the same level that I was expecting it to. Scope and scale of the monster notwithstanding, and we're going to talk about that. But
the effects feel like a different route to almost comparable level of realism, I guess.
The effects, there are moments where they work really well, and then there are other moments where I'm like, well, this is really cheesy. Like,
yeah,
I can tell this is a guy
in the original King Kong too, to be fair.
Yeah, but there were also moments in the original King Kong where I'm like, I'm not entirely sure how they did this. Like, we discussed the whole when they're combining like rear projection with live action elements with stop motion animation that they would have to have timed, 6 months prior. Like, there's a lot of artistry going on where I'm like, this is really impressive. Whereas it feels like the Godzilla stuff is like, okay, the suit is cool and like the scale is cool. And like when he fire breathes and the towers start to melt, like that's a really cool effect. But then there's other moments where I'm like, that's clearly just a guy in a suit chewing on like a little toy train. Like it kind of...
Unlike giant King Kong's face, like chewing on a man.
I guess part of it is that there's this weird, like, uncanny valley thing of like King Kong is so obviously a creature or like plasticine that you're sort of just like, okay, well, this is supposed to be cheesy or not supposed to be cheesy, but like
I don't think it's fair to judge either of those movies based on their quote unquote realism. They're both magic tricks. And it's just a matter of like, well, I think we talked about that in the King Kong episode, but it's just kind of a matter of to what extent are you like, wow, I don't know how they did that, or oh, that looks really cool. Like, I think that that's an okay reaction to both of those movies without ever thinking that they're real,
And look, there's no way around it. Anytime Godzilla was on screen, I couldn't help but think about that Arrested Development scene.
Godzilla! Okay, guys.
Godzilla!
This needs to stop now.
Where they're doing the showcase for the Japanese investors, and then all of a sudden, I think is it Buster or is it
Tobias?
It's Tobias, yeah, is in the like mole man suit.
But unfortunately, this was just as Tobias appeared in his rented mole outfit.
No, the village! Family should come out. Ow! I'm very particular about building code.
Anyway, so this is the problem, right? These things have been parodied ad nauseum over the last 70 years, that it's hard to sort of separate them and take them for their full, original power. There are moments where I think the effects are really, really strong. And then there are moments where they feel a little bit more ropey, like all of the fire flames, like they don't really look particularly good. I think this is a perfect time to talk about what we mean by suitmation, because obviously like we've referenced it multiple times without actually talking about what does this mean, because that is what sort of is unique to this film compared to King Kong, is that it's not making use of stop motion animation, because they realized it would just like the scale and time it would take was just unfeasible. So what did they do instead, Nate?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's actually, this is a similar story in some ways to Jurassic Park. It was the same sort of trajectory of like, they also started out thinking like, yeah, we'll do it with stop motion. And they're like, yeah, that's not really working.
Doesn't look very good. And,
yeah. But yeah, in this case, they basically invented like a whole new way of doing these kinds of movies, right? And suitmation, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's animation of a sort, not really.
Not really. It's
using
just
a guy in a suit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Typically. And so basically what they're doing is they have these huge sets that are made out of miniatures and then a guy in a big rubber suit. And so like this Godzilla suit weighed about 100 kilograms or 220 pounds.
Just insane.
Which is wild. And the guy inside is a guy named Haruo Nakajima. And he was considered sort of like, again, the founder in some ways of this kind of acting. Before this, he was a stunt actor in samurai films. And so like a lot of the folks who end up playing these roles are like basically stunt performers. And this is what struck me, like coming at this as someone who watched like Power Rangers as a kid, and then now having watched some of the later Godzilla movies also produced by Toho. I think that he does a very good job of making this version of Godzilla feel like an animal a little bit more than some of the other iterations of it. And apparently he actually like went to the zoo and watched how different animals moved. Like, how does the elephant walk, right? How does it like lumber along? And how does a bear use its front paws to like grab at things? And you kind of see both of those in this movie. I really like that moment as he's coming through the electrical barrier and there's like sparks flying, and I think it's maybe nighttime. And so like the suit looks very good because it is lower light. And he's moving really slowly. And then there's that atomic breath, which, as we talked about, doesn't look that great. No. But it like melts one of the towers.
Yeah, that looks so cool.
Which was like one of those moments where I was like, I don't really know how they did that.
Yeah.
There's some other cool moments where he's like fighting tanks and things like that. Yeah. But then other times there's stuff where it doesn't look all that great. The jet fighters come and attack him.
I was just going to say the jet fighters look like they're just on strings. And...
Yeah, and the rockets are kind of like flying past him and his arms are kind of flailing and stuff like that. And it just doesn't totally hold up. So it's very hit and miss. But for me, there are enough moments in it where I'm like, that was very cool. Like, how did they do that? Or just the level of detail in some things. Like, again, those power lines look great, and some moments in the city look great. And then other things like the train looks like a little tiny toy,
Yeah.
And so it's just like a real mixed bag, but you got to give some respect for the time where it's just like they did something completely new and they did it in like 2 months.
And again, like we've talked about, this is always the difficulty of watching these sort of older films, is like we're watching them with a modern eye. And even if you try your hardest to watch it with the context of when the films were made, Jurassic Park now exists, right? Like, you simply cannot erase what has come before it. And that's not to say that there aren't moments where, like you said, you go, I'm not really sure how they did that. I remember when I saw Metropolis for the first time, the 1923 movie, there are special effects in that I think still hold up. Like it's not to say that it's impossible, but it is very difficult for, a film of this age when it relies on things like special effects that can very quickly become dated, for an audience to not sort of separate that. But I think the biggest thing for me is just like a lot of the sequences just felt overly long.
Which we talked about with King Kong too, a little bit, of just like, again, I think the philosophy of action sequences has changed a lot because you have people that have really tightened it up, right?
Yep.
Whether you're talking about like George Lucas, or you're talking about John McTiernan, or like any number of action directors that have gotten really good about like, well, character needs to be part of it, and like the objective has to be really clear, and like all of those little elements that now we almost take for granted. Not that every movie does it. Lots of contemporary movies do a terrible job at it, but like these movies, it's at a time where the action is just kind of like, okay, and now some more stuff happens and some more stuff. And then they move to a new area and then some more stuff happens. And it's not really clear. Like, for example, when Godzilla is attacking the city, it's like there's nothing that's sort of like, if he gets to this place, then a bad thing happens. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
It's like, no, he's just kind of rampaging through the city and they're fighting and he's fighting back and then he just goes back to the bay. The stakes are not necessarily escalating throughout that scene in the same way that you would do now.
I remember saying this in the King Kong episode. At times it feels like they're trying to show off, hey, look what we can do with special effects. And the problem becomes that when you then watch it 70 years later and you're like, these special effects don't look very good by today's standards. Now it just feels like you're spending a lot of time looking at a non-impressive effect. And I think that's part of what makes a movie like Jurassic Park, and there's a reason why I keep bringing this up. We're going to get to it later. But there's a reason why a movie like Jurassic Park, I think, sort of withstands the test of time, because Spielberg resists that urge to be like, hey, we made a CGI dinosaur. Let's spend lots of time showing off how awesome the CGI dinosaur is. No, he's just using it strategically where it makes sense and is only using it for a storytelling device to get across what needs to be told as efficiently as possible. And that's where this film kind of lacks. But I will say there is a moment in, I guess it's probably the last rampage sequence that almost brought a tear to my eye, which is when there's a mother and her two children and Godzilla's attacking the city. And she says, don't worry. We'll soon be with daddy. We'll soon be where daddy is. It's okay. And I was just like, obviously it's like, was daddy lost during the war or was daddy lost during another rampage or what? But like that moment for me as a parent, it just like, that was gut wrenching. And that was one of those moments where I was like, okay, now you've established some stakes. Now there's like, you are putting the human emotion of like the devastation that this is causing. Because that's the thing, when you see like towers being knocked over, blah, 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 like there's obviously destruction going on, but it's when you bring in that human element, when you're reminded that there are people in those towers. Those are people's homes or those are people's offices. And it's like 9/11, like we've witnessed that kind of destruction and the impact it has on humans. So it's when it ties back to that sort of thing, I think it's incredibly effective. I just wish they did that more, because I feel like that is very much lacking through a lot of these destruction scenes. It's just like, oh, Godzilla's on a rampage. He's destroying a bunch of infrastructure. Yeah. You're not really seeing the human toll of like that destruction.
Yeah. Well, and I think like, again, some of the impact I think is the cultural context. So like,
of course,
some of the imagery that they're drawing upon for those scenes. And then maybe even more importantly, the aftermath is like, we often think of Nagasaki and Hiroshima as being like the major attacks in Japan, but like Tokyo was also firebombed in World War II. And so like some of that imagery, I bet, is sort of embedded in those scenes. And then the aftermath is apparently very reminiscent of like the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The injured people and the people who have radiation poisoning lying in these sort of makeshift hospitals afterward, I found that quite evocative. And that's sort of the moment too where our human protagonist, Emiko, is finally like, no, I need to tell Ogata about this weapon that could save us because, yes, I know Serizawa told me I can't, I shouldn't, right? It needs to happen because, the toll is too high. And like, I did find that quite moving, which I guess maybe is a good segue into the finale.
It sure is. The Oxygen Destroyer.
Yes, the Oxygen Destroyer. So, Adam, I mean, what do you think about Dr. Serizawa's invention and the way it's depicted and all of that? I mean, is it compelling? Is it silly? Is it what is it?
Oh, it's very silly. I mean, obviously, like what they're getting at is interesting, and the devastation or the possible impact is, again, it's like you said, there was this idea of like, we need to talk about nuclear armament without talking about nuclear armaments. So like, I understand there's that at play. It really feels like something out of a Metal Gear Solid game, and I don't mean that as a compliment. Like, it's some serious Hideo Kojima level of nonsense.
Yes.
And then when you finally like see the device and them using it and everything, like those are some cool effect shots, I guess. You know what it also reminds me of, and this will come up again in a future episode, but in the like Adam West Batman movie, where they have the like weird I don't even know how to describe it, but it's the dehydration gun that turns people into powder. Like, it's bordering on that even in terms of like the production design.
Yes.
So it's just like, it feels very silly.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that it has this like devastating possible effect.
Yes.
So yeah, it's flawed.
Yeah. I mean, like, just to explain, like, supposedly this weapon, what it does is it removes all of the oxygen, I guess, from water only, maybe, question mark? He only ever uses it in water.
He only uses it in water, but he does say, like, one drop of this will remove... So, yeah, I guess it's unclear,
but then it takes all of the oxygen out of, like, living creatures as well.
Yeah.
So, like, in effect, it turns them into skeletons in the movie.
But but there must be more to it, because if it only works in water, it doesn't seem like that devastating.
Right.
Because we don't live in water, so it's like, I guess you
can get rid of drinking water, I guess? I don't know. Not totally
oxygenated
explained.
water. But yeah, anyway, the point is that it's supposed to be, the equivalent of another nuclear level weapon in the wrong hands, be it the villains or the military. It could be used for catastrophic destruction, which is why he says, like, I may have made it, but I can never use it, and I will go to my grave with this secret.
Right. This whole sort of like plot and like the ambivalence about the technology and the philosophical conversations also had me thinking back to Michael Crichton a little bit as well.
Yeah, a little bit.
It made me think a little bit about Westworld, and we were already talking about Jurassic Park, but it's got a little bit of that, like, this new technology and like, how is it going to change how we live, and like, should we be using it? Should we not? How should we be using it? Like, all of that stuff made me really think
So
about,
what you're saying is, if Jeff Goldblum had shown up for the final act, we would have enjoyed this a lot more.
Yeah. Actually,
he should have been in the American localization.
Yeah. Dr. Serizawa's got a little bit of that sort of like Jeff
Dr.
Goldblum
Ian Malcolm
in Jurassic Park vibe.
Okay.
He's not quite as cheeky. He's a little more depressed, but...
Yeah, he shows a lot less chest, that's for sure.
Yes, a lot less chest, for sure. But yeah, I mean, like, this movie, I think, on one hand, has some, like, very serious aspects to it, but it also is a campy movie, right?
Oh, very, yeah.
And the thing that I like about Dr. Serizawa in some ways is, like, he's got an eye patch. He's, when you go to his house, he is like in a Hammer horror movie.
I was gonna say, he lives in Dr. Frankenstein's lab.
Right, exactly. He's got like beakers and bubbling things, and like, but it's also kind of gothic. Like, there's wrought iron and stuff like that.
Tesla
like,
coils. Yeah,
it's great, and it is campy, and like, I think that's okay. It does take a little bit of getting used to the tone of this movie, because it can be quite, I don't know if I would say it's self-serious, but like, it does deal with some of these big philosophical questions, but then it also has this side to it that is quite silly. So,
including the final way they dispose of Godzilla, which it feels pretty anticlimactic, if I'm being honest.
I agree. So yeah, I mean, do you want to explain sort of like, what is the final mission? How do they decide to dispose of him?
So Imiko basically reveals that this thing exists. He agrees that he will let them use it, but he burns his notes so that it can only be used once. And then they basically are all on a boat. Serizawa and, is it
Ogata?
It is Okata. Okay, so they both put on dive suits, like old-timey dive suits, and bring the oxygen destroyer underwater. And then basically they're going to turn it on, and Ogata, surfaces, and then they realize, wait, where's Dr. Serizawa? Where's Dr. Serizawa? And he obviously realizes, as he says, what is to stop the government from compelling me to tell them how I did this? So he sacrifices himself. He stays underwater so that, along with the oxygen destroyer destroying Godzilla, it will destroy its creator as well. So it will never be able to be used again.
Yeah.
And you get this kind of interesting, but mostly kind of cheesy effect of Godzilla's sort of dematerializes and decomposes into a skeleton that, again, like the scale of all of it is completely off, and it doesn't really work. And then the movie, if memory serves, it just ends with the end title card. I
think Dr. Yamane sort of says, like, if H-bomb tests continue,
you're
there
right.
could be another Godzilla.
There could be another Godzilla, yes. And of course, this is the thing, is that in the American localization, all of this is very unclear what is happening. They don't really get into the whole, like, if I do it, they'll compel me to use it again. And
Yeah,
so like
none of that.
they're freaking out about the one guy not coming to shore, but like you don't really understand why this is important, whereas it's much clearer in the Japanese version. So
right, and it doesn't help that both Ogata and Dr. Saruzawa are voiced by the same person.
Yes.
In the American version.
And not only that, in the American version, like the entire climax plays out, and just every like 30 seconds to a minute, they just cut to a reaction shot of Raymond Burr. And it's so cheesy because it's just like, oh. Yeah, again, that movie has some flaws, but yeah, so the movie ends on this like kind of anticlimactic finale.
It's a bummer. It doesn't really have. Again, like maybe it's just the philosophy's changed a little bit of like what an action movie climax is, I guess.
They saved the day, so like they destroy Godzilla, so I guess that's a good thing.
But you don't get any kind of like final struggle with Godzilla, really.
No.
Because you see, in these scenes, you're seeing him underwater and you kind of see him walking around and stuff.
Yeah.
But they don't ever like get attacked by Godzilla underwater.
The boat is totally fine.
Boat's totally fine. They're totally fine. They just kind of get close and set off the device. Yeah. So it's like, it is a little anticlimactic for sure. Apparently, Honda, the director, actually like pioneered early underwater shooting in Japan.
And we know how I feel about underwater
exactly back to that conversation. This is actually a good example of your problem with it, is that it's very much like, we know how to shoot underwater, and so we're going to shoot underwater, and here are some people walking underwater, and then like not a lot happens.
Moving.
Exactly. There isn't any room for action in this final sequence, partly because it's underwater. Exactly. I mean, but yeah, he actually pioneered this technique in the documentaries he had to direct before becoming a feature director. Right. And that was pretty recently. So it's sort of like, maybe he was also like, I know how to do this thing. We can like integrate it into the movie. And at the time it was probably still a novelty to like see underwater. But definitely. Like, obviously Godzilla isn't actually shot underwater in this. It's still just a guy in a suit with like some smoke and a filter or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I agree that the climax might be the weakest part of this movie compared to the action of the rest of it. Like, one thing we didn't talk about with the special effects, and this is sort of a leg up that it has over King Kong, in my opinion, is the fact that like it was hard for King Kong to destroy anything because it's stop motion.
Right. Yeah.
And so, like, because these are actual real physical things that are moving in real time, Godzilla can like step on a building and crush it. And
that's
it can
true.
And it has all these beams and things that split and like break. And like, that's a different kind of spectacle than what you get out of King Kong. But there's none of that in the conclusion. The conclusion's just a guy in a suit walking around.
Well, and as we said, they obviously defeat Godzilla, but that did not stop them from making a boatload of sequels.
Yes.
So, Nate, let's talk a little bit about the legacy, the sort of aftermath of this film, because as we sort of alluded to earlier, this is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest running film franchise.
Yeah.
Which, as a James Bond fan, I was like, that doesn't seem possible. But then it 100% is possible.
Totally.
It's not only more films, but again, 1954 until today. So what came after?
Yeah. So there were 33 Japanese films produced as part of this series and 5 American films. So 38 films in total. And they really range very widely. Like, this is such a long-running series that you actually have to like divide it into different eras, and they typically use the names of the Japanese emperors to like define different eras. And they all have slightly different characters, different people involved. Like Ishiro Honda and the special effects whiz behind the first one stay with it for a long time, but then it changes hands, right? And the actor in the Godzilla suit changes hands a little bit.
So it really is Japan's James Bond.
Yeah. In some ways it is. It has passed through generations of interpretation now.
Roger Moore shows up and they do a blaxploitation Godzilla.
Right.
Live and let die.
Exactly. So the thing that happens pretty quickly, like after the first sequel, is the movies start getting a lot campier. And it becomes a lot more about like, we need another different monster now. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know if the budgets went up? Like, was this one of the things that like it was successful, so they spent more money? Like,
I think the budgets went down.
Okay, yeah.
That's my impression. I mean, I don't
Okay.
know for sure, but I think the budgets went down because basically once they had the techniques, some of the sets, and some of the suits, you could just keep producing
Churn these
movies.
things out, right? Yeah,
right?
that makes
Until
sense.
the suit like falls apart and you have to replace it, presumably. But yeah, so you start getting like Rodan and you start getting Mothra and you get all of these other characters that start becoming part of the Godzilla universe. At first, they're kind of loosely tied together, and then you get other movies that kind of Avengers style really tie them together with some kind of common story. So, like I said, I watched Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, which is basically like, how do I describe it? Ghidorah is like the space squid at the end of Watchmen.
Okay.
So it's like this sort of like Avengers level threat, right? That literally is from outer space and comes and is going to destroy everything. And so Godzilla, Rodan, and Mothra all have to team up to take down Ghidorah.
Sure.
Very silly, right? And of course, like I'm coming into it not having seen all of these movies. So all of all of the mythology is totally bizarre to me. Mothra is called by two twin tiny fairies that sing a song to call Mothra. And I guess in the Mothra movie, Mothra is a moth, but in this movie, Mothra is like a caterpillar.
Okay.
And so it's literally just like a little caterpillar moving along the ground and has to ride on the back of Rodan in order to attack. Like
I'm looking at the poster now, which is just astonishing.
it is deeply silly. It's a lot of fun. It's all bright colors, crazy costumes, convoluted political intrigue that involves like, you know, a princess from Venus and like it's total craziness. But number one, that's still pretty fun. It's fun to watch these like guys in rubber suits like flop against each other. And it's probably like what the Simpsons writers are thinking of when they think of the characters of Godzilla and even like who they include in the reference we talked about today. It's like, yeah, it's Rodan and Mothra and Godzilla together, right? Like just like in this movie. I think that ultimately is probably how most people think of the Godzilla series. And maybe that's okay, you know, that all of these different versions of Godzilla can kind of coexist. In some ways, this franchise more successfully allows different versions to coexist than like many other franchises have. And you can appreciate what all of them bring to the table in different ways.
I just need to call out that there's a sequel from 1974 called Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla.
Yep.
Which looks absolutely insane. So, wow. I'm speechless, honestly. Well, that brings us to the part of the show that we like to call the parts that seem like Simpsons jokes but aren't. Nate, were there anything that sort of jumped out to you as feeling particularly Simpsons-y in this?
Yeah, I mean, well, number one, anytime there's a town hall meeting, I always think of The Simpsons. But it just the sort of like talking back and forth and like jibes and people yelling and stuff always makes me think of The Simpsons. But also monster movies make me think of The Simpsons. More so the sort of Ghidorah vibes of just like crazy nonsense. But even at times Godzilla in this movie, like the moments where Godzilla's arms are flailing wildly and things like that also make me think of The Simpsons. But yeah, what about you?
Well, I mean, the film opens with the title card that says made with the support of the Japanese Coast Guard. And I don't know why, but that just like immediately I was like, that feels very Simpsons-y. It's that weird specificity. And then it's like such a boring thing.
It reminds me of our episode on The Mask of Zorro, right? Because they have that long credit sequence at the end of The Poke of Zorro. And I think there is a line like that in that credit about maybe it's the government of Canada or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. And then all of the Americanized version feels very Simpsons-y, but there's one moment in particular where I think it's like right after the confrontation in Shirazawa's basement where the actor dubbing the character very clearly has changed for one line of dialogue. So it reminded me very much of the end of the Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie thing where it's like, I have to go now. My planet needs, like, it really, because it's just like, it's not even close to being the same voice. And then I also mentioned before, like the way it keeps cutting back to Steve Martin, not that Steve Martin, but this Steve Martin in the climax, it has this sort of like Simpsons-y feel to it.
Yeah, it's got some Troy McClure vibes of like just one of the crappy movies he would be in.
Yeah, totally.
You know, he could play the Raymond Burr character.
Troy McClure would be a great Steve Martin.
Yes. Not that Steve Martin.
The other Steve Martin. So Nate, how did this movie do? Obviously it did well enough or made enough money and didn't cost enough money that they made 38 more of these things.
Yeah.
But was it a box office success by 1954 standards?
Yeah, so as I said, this was the largest Japanese budget for a movie ever at the time. So huge bet. And again, even at that, it was like only done in 2 months and they had to cut corners. So it was $900,000 US dollars at the time, which adjusted is about $10.4 million today.
Okay.
And in Japan, the movie made $2.25 million.
Oh, wow.
So more than double its budget, which, and again, adjusted, that's about $26 million. Now, the US release of Godzilla King of the Monsters made an additional $2 million.
Damn. Okay.
Yeah. It did quite well. Just for context, only 3 foreign films had ever made this much money before. And the others were all actually Italian art films that also were imported by Levine. So this was like a really huge deal. And in terms of like where it sat in the year, in 1954, the top movie of the year was The Ten Commandments, which made $85 million. So a lot more.
But could not be more different.
And at this time, there's sort of limited box office numbers. But looking down at number 15 on the list, you have The Wrong Man, which made $2 million. Okay. And so that means that Godzilla very well could have been in like the top 20 for the year.
Right.
Which, again, for a Japanese film at the time was a huge deal. And obviously, like, not only spawned many Japanese, like, sequels and spin-offs and other movies inspired by it, but also, like, was part of the sort of 50s monster craze in the U.S., along with these movies like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and so on. The other thing I guess worth mentioning is that, as we said, like, in 2004, for the 50th anniversary, this movie was actually re-released in the U.S., the original version.
Right.
And it made about $500,000. So,
okay.
Yeah, not a ton. Around this time was when they were basically like, we're going to take a break from Godzilla. And so they actually stopped producing movies for 10 years.
Wow. By they, you mean Toho?
Toho. There was like the re-release in 2004, and then there was another movie, I can't remember what it's called, but in the Godzilla series that was new that came out around the same time. And like the box office wasn't doing so well. So they're like, we're going to take a break for a decade, which like, think about that in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Who would commit to that, right? But they did. They actually stuck to it. And the Gareth Edwards Godzilla in 2014 is the return of Godzilla to the big screen.
Oh, damn. Okay.
And sort of kicks off the current MonsterVerse series, like, you know, Godzilla versus Kong and so on. And then you also get like the Japanese editions of like Shin Godzilla, Godzilla -1.
Right.
That's all part of this sort of new phase after the break. So
fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty interesting, the philosophy there. So obviously the movie got no Academy Awards because it's the 50s and it's a Japanese film. And at the time, I think also like the special effects were met with like mixed response, you know. Again, it's a very different technique, very different approach than other things that were happening at the time. People did really appreciate the sort of craftsmanship of Ray Harryhausen and other folks like that were doing stop motion. So yeah, it may not have even necessarily been appreciated for that. So let me read you a couple reviews from the time when Godzilla was re-released in theaters in 2004. I didn't really want to do reviews of King of the Monsters from 1956 because that's not really the movie that we're talking about. So the first time that we get American reactions is this sort of 2004 period. So this one is from Stephen Hunter from the Washington Post. And this is a more positive take. So he says, it certainly must have been tragic to the Japanese audiences. In its burning city mega violence, it conjured up black and bitter memories of B-29 bombers pounding Japanese cities during the last 2 years of World War II, including the visits of Fat Man and Little Boy to that island nation in August 1945. But that's not really what commends Godzilla to our attention, and it's a shame. Instead, this film will be looked upon as the acorn from which grew a tiny oak namely the campy series of monster pics that seem much better when you're high or drunk. Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, Godzilla versus Mothra, Godzilla versus Anne Margaret. It's best to banish any memories of those extravaganzas from your mind and simply contemplate a culture contemplating its own deconstruction by external forces, which is what this film affords. So kind of interesting, again, much like we're doing on the show all the time, all of these people trying to deconstruct the way that they've interpreted a film through pop culture without ever having seen the original film.
Yeah.
And so like this, Stephen Hunter's sort of saying like, okay, we have to forget all of the things that we watched on TV in the 70s that were like these like dubbed versions of the Japanese sequels to a movie you never saw.
Yeah.
And like just try to take this movie at face value, seeing it for the first time in 2004. But you know who hated this movie? Roger Ebert.
That's my boy.
Yeah, I was like, you bet.
I'm in good company now.
Yep. So
Hate's a strong word, but
his quote, he says, "This is a bad movie."
Okay.
But it has earned its place in history, and the enduring popularity of Godzilla and other monsters shows that struck a chord.
I mean, yeah, I kind of can't disagree.
Yeah. He's one of those people who's like, the effects in King Kong are just better. And he doesn't like the characters, doesn't like the dialogue, you know?
Yeah, interesting.
I think I have a soft spot for the sort of balance of campiness and seriousness that this movie has going on. And I kind of appreciate that it launched all of these sort of like campy sequels, but you'd have to be ready for that aspect of it and feel okay with it being kind of soap opera-y and silly and like not sticking to it, the seriousness of its premise in some ways.
Yeah, what I would say is I think the King Kong comparison, I think the themes are stronger here, but the execution is maybe stronger there.
Right.
Especially when you consider that it's being made 20 years earlier with all of the sort of limitations that affords. Well, okay, so Nate, I guess that leads to the ultimate question. For you, do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses?
So I would say yes. I think the strengths outweigh the weaknesses. You know, this is sort of dovetailing a little bit with our extra credit here, but I would say the best way to watch this movie would be to watch Godzilla -1 and then watch this movie.
Interesting. Okay.
Because, you know, to your point about adaptations, it's like Godzilla -1 in some ways is an adaptation of it's sort of like if someone just told you the general premise of Godzilla and then you went and made a movie. It's kind of like that.
It's the Ocean's 11 of Godzilla. Then,
right.
because...
That's a great comp. Totally. It's just a complete reinvention, but the same basic idea of like a radioactive monster attacks Tokyo. It's post World War II. I think Godzilla -1 is a better movie all the way around, but I think you'll appreciate it even more seeing the original movie that is sort of inspiring it. The other really interesting thing about Godzilla -1 that I was realizing as I was doing research for this movie is that before Ishiro Honda started working on Godzilla, he was actually working on a movie about a kamikaze pilot. And it was deemed to be too critical and grim at the time to be produced. And so it was like cut short.
Right.
The interesting thing is the protagonist of Godzilla -1 is a kamikaze pilot.
Oh, interesting.
Who abandons his mission. You know, little bit of a spoiler, happens at the very beginning, but I just thought it was a very interesting connection. Couldn't find anything online about whether that's like an intentional nod.
Right. Yeah,
but I mean, it feels so steeped in the history of this movie and like so respectful of it that like I feel like it must be. So like that would be my recommendation is yes, you should see this movie, but like Godzilla -1's a great entry point into this series. So see that and then see this. What about you, Adam?
I'm torn because do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? I want to say yes, but I'm not entirely sure that they do. But I also don't know that, again, it's really hard for me to say that with any level of certainty because I feel like this movie is 70 years old and it's just so hard to put it. There's so much you have to overcome. You have to overcome the way it's aged. You have to overcome the cultural context, which we as North Americans can't fully embrace or
who could
truly
barely even say the characters' names properly.
Yes, exactly. So I feel like it's got a lot working against us as North American film viewers. So again, I think the themes are really interesting, and I think it has interesting things to say. Certainly, I would say between the two, the American localization or the Japanese original, watch the Japanese original. Like, there's no need to watch the localized version beyond this sort of like interesting artifact. But yeah, I don't know if it fully worked for me. But I also wouldn't go so far as to say like it's not worth seeing. I almost wonder what the experience would be like going to see it in a theater with a bunch of people who love it and revere it, and then a bunch of newcomers. I think that's probably the best way to watch it, not on a Monday night after drinking some overly strong Japanese whiskey. But in terms of extra credit, I mean, Nate, you've already dropped one of the pieces that you would suggest. What are the other things you would pair with this?
Yeah, so one of the other ones that immediately comes to mind, I find this sort of like post-nuclear Japanese cinema and anime and all that sort of stuff really fascinating. And so one of the other ones that I immediately was thinking of is Akira, right, from 1988.
Which I only saw for the first time last year.
And the animation in that movie still is incredible, number one.
Mind-blowing.
And it is a movie that is a little bit tough to follow, partly because I think it's adapting like an incredibly long manga that has all sorts of twists and turns, and it's sort of like condensing it. And
you want to talk about Hideo Kojima nonsense, that movie gets weird.
Yes, but it's all about the vibes. And I think like it sort of takes place in Neo Tokyo after some kind of horrible disaster levels part of the city, and it's been rebuilt. And then there's this sort of specter of it happening again, and it's clearly sort of this reference to the atomic bomb. And then there's also this whole sort of question of mutation and human potential, and it's just a really incredible movie to watch. Again, if you could ever see it in theaters, I mean, God bless. But even at home, I think it's a great watch and a really interesting pairing to, again, look at how this history in Japan is being grappled with in another medium.
Absolutely.
What about you, Adam?
Well, I mean, my other Godzilla touch point was the Gareth Edwards 2014 film, which he's the filmmaker behind Rogue One and the creator, which we talked about in our Oscars special. And he's a filmmaker that I really, 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 really admire. Comes from a visual effects background, and I think as a result, his films have a really, really unique application and use of visual effects and understanding of how to use visual effects to the best of their abilities. And so Godzilla 2014, my favorite film critic, Mark Kermode, was raving about it when I was listening to the podcast, and I was like kind of far behind it. It was still playing at one of our local Cineplexes, but it was playing like in the small theater. And I remember being so bummed that I ended up catching it in the small theater and not like in IMAX or like AVX or like one of the big theaters, because it really, the imagery is really cool. It has such a cool credit sequence. I haven't seen it since, but I remember really, really, really liking it. And then the other one that I kept referring to it for a reason, Jurassic Park. I was reading that Spielberg said that the American localization was a film that he watched a ton as a kid and had a huge influence on that film. And when you know that, it sort of makes sense. Like even the staging of the T-Rex reveal is kind of similar to how they staged Godzilla sequences. So yeah, I mean, that to me is sort of like the ultimate modern monster movie. I think it holds up just so incredibly well.
Yeah. And you even get a little nod in The Simpsons in this episode when Lisa's actually looking out the window of the airplane and you see Godzilla's eye. It's doing the little pupil dilation.
Yeah, the pupil dilation, exactly.
Yeah, from the T-Rex in Jurassic Park. So there you go.
And then the other thing, too, is if you're sort of like into this sort of monster movie thing, Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim, that was his like kaiju movie that he made a few years back, which I think I saw that in like IMAX 3D. And it's like, I don't know that it would necessarily hold up on home viewing, but in a theater, it was a lot of fun. And just like, you know, robots and giant monsters beating the crap out of each other for an hour and a half. That's a lot of fun. So
totally.
Well, and with that, that brings us to the end of this episode and also the end of this season of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. We're just going to take a brief hiatus. Nate and I need to sort of catch our breath and get caught up and watch a bunch more movies and do a bunch more research. But don't worry, we will be back. I am very excited about what we're coming back with. I don't want to spoil anything, but it's we're going to experiment. We're going to do a little like two-parter type thing. It's not to say we're doing 2 episodes about the same movie, but it'll all make sense when it's revealed, and I'm very excited. And we have some incredible guests lined up for next season as well. So
Sure do.
I promise it'll be worth the wait. So
yeah, we'll be back in June. It's not going to be too long.
Exactly. So if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. It really makes a huge difference. We're starting to slowly but surely climb those iTunes charts here in Canada. We don't stand a chance in those other countries, but hey, that's fine. And as always, Nate,
we'll see you around the Plex.
See you around the Plex. I had some Japanese whiskey while I watched the film because I thought that was appropriate. I finished off the little bottle that I bought a while ago. But then I realized that was probably a bad call because A, I got way too drunk way too quickly because that stuff is strong. And B, Japanese whiskey, for whatever reason, always gives me a really bad hangover. So I was like, the next morning I had like this horrible headache and I was like, ugh. So double bad mistake, but it was very tasty. Very, very tasty.
Oh, yeah, I like Japanese whiskey.
Okay, and on that note, let's begin. I'm just going to belch first. Jesus, okay. All right.